Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Robbins, President and Managing Director of the SIP Forum. I want to welcome everyone to Day 5, Session 4 of the 2021 Stir Shaken Virtual Summit. The next hour, we're going to talk about, the fact that June 30th has passed and find out what's truly expected for voice service providers. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Rebecca Johnson, founder and CEO of Numeracle. Rebecca is going to serve as the moderator for this session. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks, Mark, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this year's virtual summit. I think each one of these has been quite successful, so super excited to not only be speaking, but also sponsoring the event as well. So really want to thank you for that opportunity and jointly doing that with John Bruno here, who is joining us on this topic. So for those who don't know me, Rebecca Johnson, founder, CEO of Numeracle. Really been focused on solving the enterprise gap with regards to Stir Shaken and bringing solutions out to the industry. I serve as a subject matter expert on really serving from the enterprise side, like what is the challenge, how are we successful, and through the SIP forum, this is where we've been able to bring that conversation to the table with the very, very innovative and creative minds that you have witnessed this week to talk about that. So speaking of innovative minds, I have with me John Bruner, who is the president and CEO of Aegis Mobile. This is a name that you will hear more often. Why? That's because John really is the subject matter expert when it comes to know your customer. We've had several conversations and presentations this week about this concept. So I'm super excited that to end and round out this week, we're really going to talk to the experts on Know Your Customer and actually something actionable that you can do today to be able to address this particular gap. With us on the panel, not to be confused, we have Stephen Smith and Steve Augustino. So Stephen is truly an entrepreneur in the space of communications, but always with the element of compliance, which makes sense why when we're talking about post June 30th, what are we supposed to do from the service provider? Let's really talk to somebody who actually knows what steps you should be implementing, and Stephen will be able to address that. Then we have, we can't really talk compliance unless there's a lawyer on the panel. So we've got Steve Augustino from Kelly Dry. When I think about a subject matter expert in this space for the robocall mitigation plans and KYC, Steve was the first one that came to mind, so I'm really honored that he was able to join John and I on this particular panel. So let's cover what we're going to talk about, because amongst this group right here, these 4 panelists, every time we've met on this topic, I think we've gone down a different rabbit hole with regards to what the industry needs to do and what is it from the regulatory perspective that we need to be aware of. So we're going to try really hard to stick to our key points today, and that's to cover that role of Know Your Customer in communications, how to use KYC to implement an identity vetting and fraud monitoring protocol in support of the Robocall mitigation plan. And I say that in support of because the Robocall mitigation plan was not a checklist that you submitted to the FCC and thought you were done. So we're really going to, crack that open a little bit further. And then the voice service provider expectations, which you cannot ignore what the FTC is doing and the expectations that they have set. And then lastly, just what happens if an organization fails to comply with these Stir Shaken requirements. Hopefully nobody that's attending this session is not the one that says I'm trying to do as little as possible, but if you are, then you really need to pay attention of what could occur should you take that path. So I'm going to stop the screen share because this is really going to be about an open discussion amongst this group, and we do have a chat line for questions. Please don't be afraid to go ahead and submit those questions during the discussion because they might be relevant to what we're talking about, and we might pick them up as we're talking. So, first, to kick things off, I really want to give John the opportunity to establish the foundation for what Know Your Customer is in communications. So once we build that foundation, everything that we're talking about will kind of center from that. So John, as the industry expert on this particular matter, would you define KYC and then discuss how this process is used in other industries but now we're seeing it be applied to communications to support StirShaken and our other due diligence initiatives.
Sure, thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate that. So KYC has many different uses in many different industries and has many different levels of KYC. It started in banking and other industries where KYC was absolutely critical to protecting consumers and protecting our countries and all these wonderful things. But the carrier industry started KYC years ago on the messaging side of the house, vetting and onboarding customers that would be engaging consumers directly. And now most recently with StirShaken, the same model seems to be appearing as something that is now going to be a verified caller. The wonderful thing about knowing who these verified senders have been is that we were able to prevent people from coming back into the network that were causing harm, and also prevent people that or companies that were not of good nature or had fraud in their background could not get on the networks. And so StirShaken's taking an attempt to do the same thing. I think the one question with StirShaken is what degree of KYC will we be implementing as a best practice going forward?
And this is what's interesting. Whenever I met you, John, and we started talking about KYC, and you kind of opened up a perspective on it that I don't recall really anybody else talking about it this week. So this is the first place where we're really hearing, going from just, oh, know your customer, that's vetting. But you've really been able to look at it through the lens of a risk evaluation. And I don't think that we've talked about that in this industry and in that space specifically of, okay, we can do a know your customer, but really you're doing it to understand the risk of what that customer brings to your organization. So can you talk a little bit more about, the relationship of identity vetting as it relates to risk tied down to the communications?
Sure, and you and I have had a couple of different sessions talking about this. It's interesting because risk as a topic is, a pretty straightforward definition, but risk to a specific industry or a specific brand can be very, very different. And so the ability to configure your risk analysis to be pinpointing exactly what types of behaviors and backgrounds you want to avoid bringing into your program becomes a very critical part of risk assessment, not only from a what are you looking for in terms of behavioral background on a company or an individual, but also how deeply are you looking? There's a difference between letting somebody into a bar by checking their ID, and you don't know if they're going to come in and be a nice customer and sit and be pleasant, or if they're going to come in and rob the place. And so a deep background check in theory would prevent someone from coming into the bar and doing harm, whereas an identity analysis at the highest level is just saying, yeah, you're of age, you can come in. So two aspects, right? So what are the risk events that you're looking for specifically so that you can protect the industry that you're serving? And secondly, how deeply do you look into those risk events to provide a good KYC platform?
Yeah, and what I love, actually, again, here we go. I think that I've already figured everything out, and then you just triggered another thought. So whenever we're talking about risk, just kind of based on the webinars that we've had this week, we've always put risk at the terminating side in this, StirShaken world. It's always on the terminating side. There's the analytics, and it's really important for the analytics to be there. And then there's a display of risk to the consumer, which is kind of interesting because the whole point is the risk is displayed, consumer makes a decision. Do I want to answer or not answer? And what KYC does is it brings that risk assessment all the way to the origination point. This, I believe, is what the Trace Act was looking for. This is what the FCC is looking for, the FTC. Let's prevent this traffic from getting onto the network in the first place. So this is so crucial and key for StirShaken to actually have the effect that we're all expecting it to be. Otherwise, we're just attaching data and sending it down to the terminating side and displaying it. Like, that's not what we're supposed to be doing here. It's really that kind of perimeter check to keep the bad guys off of the network, from my perspective. And I don't know if you have some additional thoughts on that, or even Stephen, if you've got some thoughts. I saw Steve Augustino's head shaking, so I hope that was a good call.
John, I'll let you comment, but I do have a thought on that.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, so one thing is important. We all talked about StirShaken and reminded people that It's not a silver bullet. Remember, stir shaking was about putting information in the network and really about keeping bad actors from hiding, not necessarily stopping bad calls. It's KYC that is part of the stopping the bad calls, really. And the risk assessment that you have there, or what you have to look for, varies. Talk about, letting people into a bar and the kind of thing you want to do. Well, not every service provider faces the same risk profile, but not everyone has the same kinds of customers or the same kinds of capabilities. So this is not going to ever be a one-size-fits-all situation.
No.
What I would say is I've spent part of my career in investment banking, and which is a highly regulated industry, right? So there are all kinds of courses and continuing education that I have to do around anti-money laundering. If you're in the business of taking money from people and investing it, you have to be extremely rigorous about who they are. And there are all kinds of regulations, if they're foreign nationals, if they're persons of interest, about how you handle that data, what you do about it. But you cannot just accept money, right? Because what happened was people would money launder, and banks could make a lot of money by turning a blind eye, and oh, a bushel full of cash just showed up. So that's now against the law. That's now criminal if you do that. And that's what the Trace Act does to this industry, right? That's what I think about as a service provider when I'm taking on a customer and originating calls. The Trace Act, and I know we're going to talk later about some of these specific orders and cases, but I notice, I pay attention, right? I don't want someone on my network, and saying, oh, great, they brought me 5 million minutes a month and I'm going to make X dollars on it, pour it on, guys, and I wind up getting, a massive fine. So, and I don't know that all service providers yet fully understand that and are fully thinking about it from that perspective. I think we're still at, what I've actually, this is what I've learned from talking with people like you, but we're at the early days of this, right? And it's the only way that, just like the only way you really stopped money laundering was you made it a crime for a financial institution to accept that. You make it a crime or such a massive financial penalty that it's not a slap on the wrist for someone to originate fraudulent traffic.
Yeah, and you're touching on a really key point, and there's an underlying message with everything that you have said, each one of you, and it's where the responsibility lies for the vetting. Nowhere that I can see, especially in the banking, could a bank give up and say, oh, well, I'm not going to actually vet my customers. I'll just let somebody else go do that over there and let them make the decisions of what my local policy will be. That is not going to fly. It just won't. And that is not the expectation of what the FTC would even expect if they're going to come knock on your door. They're going to want to know what due diligence you did for the customer, what was your policy, and are you following your policy? So I think it's really important, and what this audience needs to understand is, where does the vetting role sit? And I would say, you can tell me if I'm wrong, it sits with the one who's vetting the customer. It's your responsibility and your risk assessment that you're going to perform.
And Rebecca, I would add one thing that we learned from premium SMS and the carrier industry was that you want your verification authority to be an independent verification authority that is not associated with traffic where the revenue is generated. And so that's also kind of a, where does it lie? You don't, in that instance, we had, CPaaS providers doing their own vetting in many instances, and the regulator said, doesn't belong there because, they have benefits by allowing people on. Not that they did, just saying that from a true auditability perspective, having a separate entity is very important.
Yeah.
Also,
so using the resources that are available to help, such as like what Aegis Mobile has. I mean, it's thousands and thousands of resources that you have to evaluate because the bad guys can hide, they're fraudulent.
Absolutely. Yeah, we talked about the many models of how bad guys hide as well. So.
It's impressive.
So I want to make one quick point though about just recognizing the shift that we're seeing in the telecommunications industry, because as you go farther and farther back, right, the concept of common carriage, that's what service providers were. We're common carriers. We treat everybody the same. We let everybody on. We don't do this sort of thing. It's not our responsibility. And in the past, it was a very, very narrow set of circumstances where you would kick somebody off the network, harass telephone calls, for example. But this has been broadening and broadening. And I think really with the Trace Act, you're seeing a focus more on the carriers, on their responsibility to police their own traffic. And that's a new concept.
What's interesting to me is that, messaging had a head start on voice in terms of verified sender versus verified caller. And there's a second concept that they introduced, which is a degree of how well do we know you and a degree of what risk are you bringing to our network, as opposed to a yes, you can call and send, or no, you may not. This is a how much can you send based on how much risk you present as an entity. So steps still to be taken with Stir Shaken, I think, potentially. Becca, are you on mute?
Yeah, the CATA best practices is a good place to look for, specifically on the Stir Shaken side. That's the call authentication trust anchor working group best practices for vetting. So it is good that we do have some of those policies that kind of frame what we should be looking at and what that risk appetite, is. So Steve, I'd like to maybe kind of get perspectives with regards from the FCC that you've seen when it comes to the vetting and specific steps if there are any.
Yeah. Well, and this is it's been a little bit of a challenge somewhat for the service providers. What the FCC said with the robocall mitigation programs was that companies had to report what specific steps they were taking to avoid originating illegal robocalls. The FCC said they were going to take a non-prescriptive approach, which is another way of saying that they're going to look at this after the fact, not front. And so they're going to use their enforcement and case-by-case situations to identify situations where the steps that were taken are not enough. So we'll learn more over time as to what is really expected and what types of activities are troublesome and need to be addressed. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing with respect to these plans is that because the commission didn't give much guidance, companies put out there what they were doing. And the reminder for people there is making a pledge to the FCC, this is what we are doing, this is what is happening. That in and of itself becomes enforceable. So I always worked with my clients to make sure that the way we describe things were manageable and they were supportable by the processes within the company. I warned them not to overpromise, really, right? Make sure what you say you're going to do, you actually can do.
And on that concept of learning more over time, John, there's, I think I've only heard you introduce this concept of this do not return list, which is something from your viewpoint and vantage, I mean, doing this for many years, you kind of developed almost like this, I don't know what to call it, but it's like an AI aspect of looking at entities, and it's more than just verify the data, right? Like there's this list. Can you kind of tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. There's actually two ways that works, and we call it the Hydra model in one instance, but in the other instance, it's really just a matter of coming back as a different entity. And so back in the days of premium SMS, Aegis was onboarding thousands and thousands of companies and vetting them to be able to run on the U.S. networks and the Australian networks and the Canadian networks as B2C messaging. And what we found is we'd find someone cramming charges on a phone bill, and we would shut them down on the carrier networks, working with the carriers immediately. And then the following week on Wednesday, we would get an application of a new company that's registering to be vetted to come on the network. And we do the background check and the relational analytics on it, which was the related companies, the key employees and all that. And we realized, hey, this company, the CEO is the brother's cousin's mother of the company we just shut down last Friday. So no, they cannot come back in. They're trying to come in as a new entity and do it again. The second thing that we found in this environment was that companies would stand up DBAs and additional, digital companies, and they'd run 150 companies and run their, bad behavior on the carrier networks and stay below the thresholds of monitoring, but be able in an aggregate to do harm. And so the relational databases and the relational vetting and the bad guy databases, if you will, enabled the capability of preventing that in that market.
And that's whenever you talk and share those types of things, I just kind of laugh to myself going, and we're expecting an originating service provider to be doing all of that. Like, you just can't do it on your own. I just don't think you can implement a stringent policy just completely on your own. So I'm always going to preach and encourage people to really understand what they're doing, you know, on the KYC. So speaking of understanding what they're doing, Stephen has, I feel like we're just following what you're modeling, Stephen. I've known you for some time now, and the industry is just catching up, right? I loved it because I would tell Stephen, this is what we're doing. He was like, we already do that. Like, this is a part of our business. But what's new here, folks? So, you know, coming from the experience of really you established your businesses. This is a core part of who you are and how you're in your business. I think that's a benefit to those who are listening. Can you just share some of your experience? And even with the industry traceback group policies, procedures, KYC, would like to just hear from you on that side.
Sure. Yeah, and what Rebecca's talking about is we are a small CPaaS company aimed at enterprises in highly regulated industries, and we knew from day one, before we stood up our platform and went to market, that we would have to have PCI DSS level 1 compliance across our platform. We knew that every customer we worked with would require us to sign a HIPAA BAA, and so we made a conscious choice that rather than checking a box on compliance, we would lean into it as the compliant communications company. And so, yeah, Rebecca and I immediately, the first time we met a couple of years ago, kind of had a similar standpoint. So yeah, so we've had an interesting experience as a small voice service provider. Prior to this year, we had an FRN. And just, you know, for those that have tried to follow through this, we paid a lot of attention to it. It was not all that hard to get the OCN. We don't hold our own numbers. So we were amongst those people on pins and needles waiting for the FCC to publish and let you register a robocall mitigation plan, because that was the gateway. You had to have that filed before iConnective would talk to you and let you gain the ability to attest calls. And I think we were all getting anxious when April 1st became April 10th, became April 15th, but by God, it all worked out, right? By the third week of April, we were able to file our plan. We had it prepared a long time in advance, and it did get in there, and then iConnective did work through the process, and we did get our certs. We're lucky enough to work with a session border controller company, CNSA, that was one of the CAs, so that let us bypass that long interop period, and we were attesting calls by early June. And so, you know, and what I feel as the CEO, you know, and operator is a huge sense of responsibility. You know, my company's SPID is now on the line for over 1 million calls that we originate a day. And, you know, any one of those that becomes a problem could come back on us. And so that's what the Trace Act has done. How we came up with our robocall mitigation plan, yeah, to what Steve said, there wasn't a huge amount of guidance there. We probably read everything we could find. We spent you know, long sessions poring over this thing, right? Which was the best guidance we could find. I probably have the page earmarked, right, where it talks about the quote minimum things that you have to have in a Know Your Customer program. Kind of, and you know, part of the fun of this panel is I'm now meeting people that I wish I had met when I was trying to figure all this out. But Steve, we kind of went down the path that you advised, which is like, well, we have to do everything we say we're going to do, and there's one place where we could see what you have to do for a Know Your Customer, and I think it's like 6 or 8 pieces of data, right, that you need to know: the company's name, its address, its place of business, its purpose, and so that's what we put in our plan. I was surprised as an operator. I mean, I guess I kind of knew it was coming, but you know, no one approved our plan. No one called us up and asked us any questions. I don't know, and you know, maybe it was discussed earlier in here that iConnective did anything other than verify. Yep, they're in the robocall mitigation database. Maybe they opened up our plan, and I feel proud of our plan. I think it's a good one, but you know, and we got our certs. So, so now, you know, as I look at it as an operator, it's on me. Well, I think the big challenge, or we're a bit old school, given our focus on regulated industries. We still sort of sell by a sales function. And a lot of way people get scale in their businesses is they need self-sign-up portals, whether they're an API company, whether they're a carrier, whether they are a campaign management thing. And they need to do that, right? And we eventually need to do that. You need to let people come to you, hit a portal, self-register, say some things, and you give them some tokens. And that's where I think what we're talking about here becomes critically important, right? It's like, well, what do? Someone hit my website and they said, here's their company name and here's an address and here's my business purpose. I guess I did a know your customer check, and that's where we're going to see how that works out for people that do that. That's not the approach, and I guess I'm kind of running with this, Rebecca, but I'm getting all my points out. That's not the approach we're gonna be taking, right? And I'm highly interested in, John, what Aegis can do. I was around back in the premium rate SMS days, and I knew about the challenges there. And I think, I mean, this is a forum. It's not a, selling anything. But your company's approach, and not only that, the decade plus of experience that you have and the databases that you have, I think are a very solid way for a company to get a sense that, yeah, these guys are real, or no, they're not.
Well, thank you very much. Do you have a marketing company that I can engage?
Sorry, I'm not,
Thank you.
I'm saying it because I mean it, really. I mean,
this is quality. That's what's showing.
I look for ways to go above and beyond with compliance. I mean, another way I look at it is my customers ought to care if I'm doing the right thing, right?
Yeah,
if I get taken down, that doesn't just affect the bad actor that I let on my network, that affects all my good customers. And so, and word is getting out. We had customers asking us about StirShaken, what we were doing about it, how were we going to make sure that our network stayed up. And so, it's out there in the industry and not just, in the group that we're talking about.
Well, you're the ideal customer. Thank you.
Yeah.
I know. If everybody modeled it, we wouldn't have this conversation if people would just implement this. But here we are. What's this, Steve?
Steve.
All right, let me comment on the mitigation plans that have been filed, because we were watching them too. We started very early with a questionnaire that we had for our clients, and it was a multi-page questionnaire, and we went through a number of different things. What do you do on this? What kind of fraud controls do you have? Can you use those to help you in identifying problematic traffic here, et cetera? And we had all this stuff, but we had to kind of just develop it on our own, like you did, Stephen. And then we started seeing people file plans, and some of those plans were I just thought are facially not insufficient. They're facially insufficient. They just didn't have enough in there. They didn't even check the 3 boxes the FCC had laid out there for them at the highest level. And that's a risk, obviously, given past history of filing requirements like this. The FCC usually goes after those who didn't file anything first. But we've got this blocking requirement in September that does a pretty good job of that, right? Then if they have the capacity, they'll look at the individual plans, but over 2,000 plans were filed. It's going to be very difficult to look at those. So mostly what I think this is going to happen is on that back end when they start to see problems. When the traceback group comes in and says, this is an entity that is originating calls, we've traced them back to this play. We've already seen a few of these cease and desist letters come out from the FCC. I think we're going to start seeing many, many more of those. And they already say, shut down that customer within 48 hours or we're going to shut you down entirely. But I think the next thing they're going to say is, and tell us why your robocall mitigation plan didn't stop this in the first place. That just seems like the natural next thing that they would do.
I couldn't agree more, and I think actually the way that we even gathered at the robocall mitigation plan did kind of put the FCC at a bit of a disadvantage, because I feel like if we had at least implemented, to Stephen's point, like components and elements, then you can actually quantitatively assess even on like a scoring of what we feel like, you know, this particular entity achieved. I don't know if there's ever gonna be an opportunity to kind of redo the robocall mitigation plan. But I do see that you know, with your point, I mean, over 2,000 plans, and there was no structure that allows you to even do some comparisons or an idea of this is a good plan versus a very strong plan. It could have been done that way, and the reason why I'm saying it could have been done is because that's a very common thing in the information security and privacy world. I can't tell you how many of those those assessments that I have completed. So maybe there's an opportunity for this to like improve as well going forward. But so what I want to do is shift the conversation to talk a little bit more about what we've seen in the practical applications of these plans and the expectations post June 30, exemplified in the FTC telemarketing enforcement orders. I think we are fools to ignore that side of it. So Steve, if you could kind of introduce what we've already seen on the enforcement side, regardless of a robocall mitigation plan. Thoughts have been put out on what the expectations are.
Right, yeah, and there's two things, because there's two really primary regulators. So the Federal Communications Commission has been sending these cease and desist letters, and that's largely triggered on traceback requests. And when you look at it, it's a relatively small threshold at which it seems to be triggering these kinds of complaints. They'll attach an attachment that has 5 or 10 traceback requests related to a particular entity that's been flagged as one of the scams or something like that. Now, I don't think that that's really the threshold, but it does suggest, when you look at the FCC side, that service providers need to take the feedback into account in their own service plans. So when you get a traceback request about one of your customers, you know, we talk about KYC as sort of upfront, but it's also how you react to the information you learn while you're serving that customer. And I think that's a first thing is really, really important. When you get those traceback requests, do something about it. Don't do nothing. I think what you really have to do is not quite clear, but doing nothing is not enough. So that's from the FCC side of it. The Federal Trade Commission started going after a couple of VoIP providers a year ago for aiding and abetting telemarketing violations. Now, the Federal Trade Commission has jurisdiction over the Do Not Call registry and the telemarketing sales rule, which is certain practices that you have to follow when you send out telemarketing messages. And the theory from the FTC was that these entities were actively participating in the violations of their end users. And so the FTC brought actions against them, alleging and aiding and abetting, basically, theory. The two things to look at, there were settlements with Alcazar and Globex. And those were both in the fall of 2020. And in both instances, those entities agreed to take a very detailed look at what their customers were doing before they provided service to those customers. And the promises are too many to list here, but what they did was it included things like digging into the ownership of the companies, like John had talked about, knowing what that is, seeing those connections, checking to see if those individuals had a previous TSR violations or had lawsuits brought against them for this, or if they had any subpoenas or any active investigations. Those are not normally things that service providers will do in a fraud check or a credit check. You're not going to do that sort of thing. So this is over and above that. Now, some may argue that these entities, because they already were participating, they have a heightened risk and therefore a heightened duty. I don't think when you read this that that's what the Federal Trade Commission thinks about this. I think that they expect that many of these things, if not all of them, are best practices that all service providers should be following.
And I think one of the things too, some of those key points that they called out as well, is a reoccurring assessment, and we don't really talk about what does the reoccurring look like. So once I have evaluated, and let's say at that point in time, Steve, they don't have that history that you mentioned. There are no, bad marks, let's say, on their past. And so then they bring them on board. It can't be that it's like, hey, we've had this customer for 10 years. I mean, a lot can change. A lot can change based on their behavior. So I think that just the reoccurrence of the screening creates its own complexities and challenges for most service providers. Again, unless you've got some kind of tools that to help you. I don't see anybody staffing up to be able to do that. John, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, let me just start on the
Okay,
time.
Steve first. Okay.
Let me do the timing part, and John can do the substance. Yeah. In the FTC settlement, they agreed to do it once a year. FCC, in its Trace Act order, said you'll perform a vetting on new and renewing customers. Now, is that renewing my 3-year agreement ends, or what is not clear on this? So just the timing is a little unclear.
Yeah, revetting is definitely best practice, and to your point, when you do it is obviously critical. But one of the things that can be done to help actually create an even more effective way of revetting is to give feedback of actual market performance of every customer or brand that's doing calling on your networks. In other words, if you see erratic behavior that's indicating potential robocalling, then a revet could happen. If you see behavior acting very normally and you don't have any suspicions whatsoever, then perhaps you go longer with that revet. And it saves the industry money. Budget for everybody obviously is important. But so, we've worked in many industries where we get a feedback loop of the actual performance. So think about supply chain, right? So you vet when you bring on a major supplier, right? That has a critical impact to your business. So you vet them before you engage in a contract and bring them on. What we often see in contracts departments is they don't take feedback from the actual customers of those vendors as to the performance of that vendor. And so the best practice is really to, you can do a background check of everything that's out there in public information, but some of the data that's even harder to find is what's their actually behavior and when engaging, on your platform or with an actual, business. That's the hard to find information. So if you integrate that and you use that as part of your revetting, you can be much more effective, both in terms of removing the bad players, but also in terms of budget.
So Stephen, with regards to, from the executive CEO level of that additional kind of oversight and, how KYC is protecting the provider through this, ongoing monitoring and examples, is there any feedback, from that perspective? You've given good feedback on how you get yourself set up with Robocall mitigation plan as a business. How have you integrated that?
Yeah,
I'm sure there's a cost structure to it. I mean, let's live in reality here.
Compliance costs money for sure. We are in the process of thinking our way through that, right? And part of self-service means we have to both do the initial vetting and the re-vetting. And I think if you want to be a serious long-term player, you need to take those things seriously, and you have to find a way to do that. I think you made maybe all the panels made a really good point. We would never dream of trying to do that in-house, right? That's a job for specialists. There are, companies like John's that I think are making it very consumable for this industry, but there's all kinds of, skip tracers and investigative data sources out there that could perhaps be considered. But I think you have to find a partner, and you have to integrate it in, and you have to recognize, another way of looking at it is how much we all stand to gain if the voice channel becomes trusted again. So it's not just I don't want to be punished, right? It's we work for a lot of enterprises, and they've over the last decade, right, have seen outbound calling become less effective because no one will answer their phone. And so I also sometimes think of it as an investment that, until we weed out the people that are committing fraud and doing bad things. And there was one other thought that was on the tip of my tongue that as we were talking about this, and I guess maybe it's a question for the group, Rebecca, it's a little bit off script, but one of the things that I haven't quite wrapped my brain around out, and maybe some of you can do it, we often have customers, when people talk about we serve enterprises, I think a lot of people that conjures up a fairly simplistic model of, here's a hospital or a individual entity that becomes a customer of ours and we vet them. And the reality is there are plenty of enterprises like that. They consume our product. There are also enterprises that are in the category of what I'd call BPO, and they might have 50 people behind them, but to me, they look like one entity, right? So I vet them, but they might have hospitals, financial institutions, everything. And how, these are questions I ask myself. What do I do about vetting them? What if they bring on a telemarketing organization that flaunts the rules and, does a lot of bad things, but 30 of their customers are good and they have a few bad actors. That's one where, I feel like everyone's just in the process of getting their high school diploma on this stuff, and maybe we're now thinking about our undergraduate degree, and that stuff's like graduate level work, right? But here's some thoughts.
Well, Stephen, you raise a good question, and it was one of the points that I wanted to make is that, yes, there is external data and external information available for the service providers, but the service providers also have to account for the data that they do have access to themselves. I talked about the traceback group requests. That's one thing. Those should be tracked. You should do something about those. A certain threshold maybe triggers a revetting of that particular customer. Many of the carriers are using call analytics, and call analytics can also tell you about changes in your customers' reputations and et cetera. And that might be a trigger. And then the third major one that I think most carriers have is the ability to track call completion rates or call duration. Many service providers have a higher rate for a certain percentage of short duration calls, for example. Short duration calls are not necessarily bad calls, but they can be correlated with illegal robocalls. And so that kind of data should also try to be integrated as you look at when and how I revet my customer.
That's great insights. Saw me taking notes here. So.
I would reinforce that because today's modeling platforms, machine learning and artificial intelligence, you can get really good at identifying patterns and anomalies within the metadata of call traffic to identify things that look like fraud. We're in a wonderful place compared to where we were 10 years ago with premium SMS.
Yeah, and Stephen, I actually just had this conversation in a call right before this panel. I did, and actually it's somebody who gave me some other ideas, so I'm going to share them here. With regards to that very challenge of, they have a BPO who has all these other clients, and what their challenge is that the BPO does not want to share who their clients are. So how does this, provider vet, who the entity is, because that identity is going to be attached. And of course, I figured it out on the call and how we're going to solve that. But it is doable. It just takes some creativity. But I did like the spirit of this particular company that everyone, no matter how far down, they're going to force through their own policy, their verification process. And if the client refuses, they're okay. You're just not going to have your call signed with a B. And then we started getting some creative ideas. Once you have a baseline of what the truth is for that particular vendor, let's say they allowed them to verify 80% of their client base. Well, they're going to still get traffic and numbers, but they have a set of these verified identities associated with these authorized telephone numbers. And then you seem to send me about 20% of your traffic I wasn't able to fully verify. They're going to do some additional analytics on top of it. So to Steve's point, they're going to bring that risk rating down and run their own analytics. So I thought it was fascinating that we're going to see some originating service providers create their own methods and processes to protect themselves. But it's complex, and I think whatever the solutions are need to be flexible for their particular model. But I think maybe in the next forum we can get some of these companies who have implemented their own kind of risk management that's more than just stir shaken, which that's the whole point here.
Yeah.
Just implementing stir shaken is not going to really solve the problem. We're going to have this whole other kind of set of principles for the originating service provider. And Steve, no doubt, the Traceback group, I think, is going to be influential in kind of pushing some of those thoughts and ideas down to what should it be, what should you be looking at?
Yeah, definitely. And keep in mind Stephen's point, right? It's not just protecting yourself from bad things. You want to restore trust in voice calling, and those outbound callers are going to be seeking providers who can get them higher call completion rates. So, being with a known or trusted service provider can be a very positive thing for your revenue.
Yep. So I am going to take one question because it's kind of right in line with what we're talking about, and then we're going to move to our next topic and wrap up. But this one is related to the responsibility of DID and VoIP providers that may not have the traffic originate on their network, but they have enabled the actor with an allocation of telephone numbers. So that's kind of like their role in the fraud is to authorize the TNs. I have a thought on that. In order for whoever the originating service provider is, you can establish a process that requires your clients to provide authorization of the TN. So let's just say, okay, we've got that part done and it's been attached to this VoIP provider is the TN provider. Then I verify and vet the identity itself. At the end, if we're implementing what we just talked about, maybe some monitoring on your own network and traffic, and those particular numbers are showing up as a high risk and fraud, well, you're going to have to deconstruct of where is it really coming from? Is it this TN provider who, wow, I've got like 20 clients and it's always the same TN provider that's bringing me, these numbers that are doing bad traffic, whatever it may be. I think you're going to have to analyze your own network. But at the end of the day, it's really the bad guy we're going after. So if you verified and validated the customer who's delivering the traffic, I really don't care where they get the TNs from. That's just the mode through which they're committing their fraud. So I don't think you can just write that off. If there's anybody else that had some other thoughts, you can.
I agree completely. You're not going to be able to absolve yourself by saying that, well, it's somebody else's providing the TNs or what have you. I'm already seeing in similar context now this theory of the service providers caused me harm by completing these bad calls, by not blocking these bad calls. We're starting to see those kinds of theories out there. And when the true, bad actors are so hard to find and, are spread around the world or wherever, and many of them don't have money, right? The focus then shifts back to the larger entity, the deeper pocket, who had a responsibility, who had some opportunity to do something. So, you still have to, you can't just say, I'm not the originating provider there, I don't have any obligation. I think you really do have to take a responsibility for the traffic that's coming across your network, whether it's originating there or it's transiting through it. That seems to be the trend.
Yeah. And I hadn't actually thought about, we're always talking about the contracts and the wording that you can put in with your enterprise client or your BPO. But I don't know if there is something that can be done between the contracts of who your other, interconnected, with regards to who you're allowing to deliver traffic to you or originate. Is that something you see, Steve, as well as another kind of counter to it to kind of put people on a standard based on a contractual term?
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing a shift in people focusing on their contract termination, the acceptable use policies, or in a carrier-to-carrier wholesale arrangement, the description of what will trigger a potential for suspension or termination of service. A lot more attention on that right now.
Okay, so before we have a couple more questions, but let's cover this last topic here, and let's talk about what happens if an organization fails to comply with the stir shaken requirements, especially this June 30th deadline. Steve, I know you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, and I think we talked about some of these things. Certainly, the first thing and the most onerous one is if you didn't file a robocall mitigation plan at all, your network can be shut down. because come September 28th, downstream carriers are not supposed to accept traffic directly from you. So that's a concern and an issue. We've also seen in the cease and desist letters more and more of this. If you don't shut down the bad customer, we're going to shut you down. So there's a lot of risk in having this traffic out there and not complying with the stir shaken obligations or the mitigation obligations. We did have a question, by the way, about international.
I was going to ask it. Perfect.
Right. It's really too much for this because that's almost another hour over in and of itself, the difficulties in international calls. Those really need to go through a trusted gateway, seems to be what's starting to happen now. And that trusted gateway is going to do the vetting. That gateway is going to do the attestation as best as it can, and then put it into the stream for termination into the United States.
And it was interesting to see how many international carriers were also submitting robocall mitigation plans as well. And I'm not sure what do we do with that, Steve?
No, nobody taking chances. That's what.
And it was all over the place. I kind of did a little bit of an analysis on, where were these, what countries were these requests coming from? And I was kind of shocked at some of them. I was like, okay, little teeny tiny islands in the middle of nowhere. I was like, all right, just literally all over the place. So, which is interesting because, hey, the news really spread fast. And that right there tells you kind of the strength and the power of the rules. What stir shaken is in the U.S. And I'm always telling this anytime I talk to different, other countries or whatever. The U.S. is setting the stage for this, right? Everyone else will be kind of following along, but really the birthplace of what is this structure like? What's the country's involvement? What is your enforcement? What rules and regs do you need to have? We're kind of setting the stage for how others will follow suit. My only concern about that is that we are literally kind of doing this as we're learning it. So we literally kicked off this call with regards to the robocall mitigation plans, and we're like, well, we're just gonna have to let it play out and see what happens. So I hope there's an opportunity where we can maybe pause as an industry and do an assessment on lessons learned and maybe some different things that we would have done had we known, because we'll be much wiser. But I don't know that we can stop that from rolling. So I think each country will just kind of catch along and implement maybe the same mistakes, and we'll have the same lessons learned over and over. But so I want to give everybody a quick opportunity to, kind of cover the key main points that they want as takeaways for the audience. And Steve, I'd like to just start with you. What are just the 2 to 3 key points with regards to post June 30th? What should they be thinking about? Give us the lawyer version here.
Right. Well, a couple of different things. First of all, remember that what you say you're doing is enforceable. So make sure that it's realistic. Do not overpromise. That is a very, very important aspect of this. But secondly, I think it's be flexible, and you have to learn. You cannot put blinders on. So as you get information, as you get traceback requests or other things that suggest maybe there's a problem, then you need to look at it. Because those carriers that the Federal Trade Commission went after, those VoIP providers, were looking the other way. And that's the main thing, is you cannot willingly blind yourself now to what this traffic is. I think that's as concise as I can make it.
Yeah. Stephen, from the executive perspective, what would be a few key points that you would share to other executives or those who have to have conversations with executives on these topics?
I think one is stir shaken is achievable, right? I mean, there were some predictions of disaster, right, 6 months ago, and we got through it, and we are not a large, well-resourced organization. So just apply some attention, and you can do it. So if you're behind, don't panic. It can be done. It takes some focus. I think the other one is we're in early days, right? That's been a theme of this conference. I was on a podcast earlier this week, and the question was, June 30th passed, where were the fireworks? Why am I still getting robocalls, right? And it's a long process, but it's tremendously exciting to be at this part. And I think you know, like many organizations, you're going to have to keep chipping at it, right? You're going to have to keep thinking about the know your customer stuff that we learned on this call. How are you going to integrate those processes in? I've picked up some, every time we've talked, I've learned things from Steve Augustino, and it's like really awesome you invited me to this panel because, you know, he's a very deservedly high-priced talent. So the revet customers if you see cues and pay attention. We joke. My internal ops team, we signed up with the ITG as part of what we've done over the last 6 months, and my internal ops team has said we're kind of looking forward to getting our first traceback to see how the call works. And I'm like, guys, you know, yes, okay, but it would probably be better if we never ever get a traceback, right? So, so that's just a little bit of levity at the end of the call here. You know, I'm upbeat about it all, and I think just this whole community and ecosystem. We were chatting with Mark before the call. It's tremendous, right? We're going to change things.
It's amazing what awareness, education, and readiness can do for you to feel much better about your business. Trust me, I understand that. John, if you would share a few thoughts from the KYC and the vetting perspective for those who are kind of just getting started.
Sure. I mean, the first thing I want to do is I think Steve and I both owe Stephen a thank you. He's complimenting everybody here. So, you know, interestingly, after 14 years of chasing bad guys, committing fraud against consumers, what we found is that the bad players are very well funded, they're very smart, and they always figure out a way to get around whatever you put in place to stop them. And so the trick is to be agile going forward and be ready to evolve, right? And to change tactics very, very fast. Do everything you can to prevent it from getting on your networks. But be ready to, you know, execute finding them because they will get on no matter what. It's kind of like, you know, cybersecurity. You can do everything, but somebody can get in if they really want to get in. So it's question is how long are they in your network? So that's what I leave everybody with. And think of it as a life cycle process, right? Front to back, you're looking at everything.
And that right there, that what you just said is the reason why we reached out to you, John, from Numeracle's perspective to partner up, because having agility in those types of solutions and that your team focuses on that every single day, building it and making it better and better while we're over here on our side focusing on the enterprise identity with the gaps and just managing the data, the structure of it, and empowering what your services can do to empower the ability for the originating service provider has some visibility and oversight with regards to the stir shaken. So as always, gentlemen, yes, I learned something new. I think we should be making this meetup once a week or every other week, and we'll just keep inflating our egos. I mean, it's good for us, right? So Mark, I think we'll welcome you back, and little, you know, word to you, Mark, great job. I know you said you were going to do any closings, but great job on another successful.
You know, I can take more flattery.
I want to thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Rebecca, Steve Squared, and John Bruner. Thank you so much. Really appreciate, you know, a thoughtful panel discussion, you know, that raised some good issues that the industry should be considering. You know, and I just want to point out for everyone, I mean, we've had a slide going back from the very beginning of the NNI task force work with a silver bullet with a red line through. You know, we've always acknowledged that stir shaken is not the solution to solving, you know, eliminating robocalls and eliminating all the fraud and other issues that exist. It's a major weapon in the arsenal that is supposed to exist in conjunction with other solutions in a complementary sort of, you know, larger solution where they're all working together to, you know, to really help solve the problem in a more fulsome way. And I think the work is going to continue. It's not over. Okay, this is going to be a multi-year endeavor. It's been already many years, but there's going to be several years in front of us with additional work to, you know, fine tune, evolve the standards, come up with some new RFCs and new standards, new documents to plug holes. I mean, it's an ongoing effort that we're enjoying. As I said earlier when we were meeting during, you know, the pre-broadcast period, you know, it's a collaborative consensus-driven effort that's really generating, great participation from the industry. So we appreciate your participation. And I want to thank Numeracle for being a gold sponsor and supporting our virtual event. And before I shut things down, I do want to say that I did consider very briefly adding a capstone session after this one, but after 23 webinars during the week, I think we all need a break. I know I do. So I just want to say that I'll be in touch with everyone with respect to what we're doing next, follow up of that. Certainly when it comes to our SIPNOC event in December, I'll be following up with everyone about that. And I think now it's time for us to break, maybe have a stirred and a shaken martini.
Mine's ready.
The order of which is up to you guys, but I want to thank you all again. Thank you, attendees, for being with us all week throughout all of these webinars. Really appreciate it. Hope to see everybody again soon, hopefully in person.
Person, yes.
Yes.
Let's do it.
All right, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Yep.
Thank you.